right, so welcome back to another episode of Leftist Labor History. My name is Nate and I'm the host. Anyway, so this episode is going to be about the post-World War II period, about 1950 to about 1980, and I finally decided to split up an episode into two parts, just because I wasn't able to come up with a nice, pithy way to combine the different themes of this era. And I've been going chronologically, and I wanted to continue that. And so this episode is going to be about civil rights and civil rights and labor. And the other part of this period is going to be something called deindustrialization. And I will hopefully record that soon. Hopefully this week, and I will talk more about that in that episode. I didn't really see a strong connection between those two themes in order to kind of fit that into one episode, and there's enough to talk about for both that I am doing this part one. So let's get into it. So if we're looking at the post-war period, referring to World War II in the U.S., if we're talking about civil rights, so I actually want to take us back to the early 40s to talk about a couple of things. So in the early 40s, in regards to race and labor, you have a string of hate strikes, which I've touched on. What is kind of significant about this series of hate strikes, or this episode, this kind of flare-up of racist animus in the labor movement, is... So I've talked about Walter Reuther, the president of the United Automobile Workers, and I've talked about the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so in the early 40s, at least in the U.S., in the northern part, and the kind of industrialized north, and the auto factories, steel factories, and so on. So there's a hate strike at Packard, which is an automobile company that is no longer around. But what happened is Packard management wanted to break up a union, wanted to divide workers. And so what they did was promote about a half dozen, a handful of black employees to nice jobs. And the kind of in the production line guy, the white guys in the factory went on strike because of that. So what is notable about this instance is that UAW leadership, Walter Reuther and his cohorts, they step in and they discipline the racist striking workers. So typically when we're talking about, I've mentioned that there's usually at least some sort of schism, or maybe not, there's the possibility, maybe not usually, but there's the possibility of a schism between the rank and file and union leadership. And a lot of times typically union leadership tends to be a little bit more conservative. The rank and file tends to be more radical and or progressive. But in this case, this was an example of union leadership coming down hard on the rank and file in doing the quote unquote right thing. I believe it's the right thing. Of course, there's a lot of I scare quote that because it implies that union leadership is not doing the right thing in other scenarios, which is complex, and I don't necessarily want to weigh in on. I don't want to paint that with a broad brush. Anyway, so that is something that's happening. Union leadership, CIO leadership, is trying to address head on the topic of race. So something else that they are doing, so beginning in 1946, immediately after the war, the CIO begins a program called Operation Dixie. And the idea is to unionize the South, is to organize the South, aka Dixie. So they're looking at, textile workers, mining, etc. These places that have been very resistant to union organizing for racial and cultural and historical reasons that I've touched on. But the South has been very resistant to labor organizing. One key reason is that black workers and white workers, primarily are not working together a whole lot, because this is the Jim Crow era, this is the segregation era, and there are black jobs and white jobs. And B, that, when they are working together, a lot of workers are racist. A lot of white workers are racist. And if they're not, the bosses are going to, drive a wedge in there wherever they can to create these divisions. And in the South, it's a little more successful in this era than it is in the North, with this shift towards integration and the kind of burgeoning of the civil rights movement. Operation Dixie is ultimately considered a failure. They just did not make, the CIO just did not make much headway into organizing Southern labor. And again, it was an uphill battle, right? They were really going against the grain, trying to get something started, and they weren't able to get it started. But there was the effort made. Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that it was union leadership just 100% being, good guys. Part of it is, there's a lot of strategic reasons to organize the South that impact, Northern workers and these large nationwide unions and federations. We're going into the era of really big labor, and there's a lot of advantages to have that reach into the South. But a big part of that is anti-black racism. The big obstacle, one of the big obstacles there is anti-black racism, and so they try to tackle it. So speaking of the civil rights movement, this is an early example of civil rights organizing. A. Philip Randolph, who I've talked about, who's the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is a black union, he begins to organize a march on Washington in 1941. So World War II is going on. The U.S. is beginning to enter the war, and the troops are still segregated. So Randolph and his colleague Bayard Rustin began to organize a march on Washington to protest this. And it's gaining enough steam and putting enough pressure on the government that Roosevelt signs an executive order to desegregate the military for the first time in 1941. It's kind of crazy, right? It seems kind of late. Okay, so A. Philip Randolph, who is active in the 20s, still active in the 40s, guess what? He's going to be on the scene. He's going to be in the mix through the 60s. Going into the 60s, so in 1963, civil rights leaders such as Randolph and Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights movement leaders organized the March on Washington of 1963, where Dr. King delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, why am I talking about that in the context of labor history? Well, the reason why is that the civil rights movement had a strong economic focus that often gets left out. For example, the March on Washington, that 63 march, is called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And it was put together in conjunction with labor. So Walter Reuther of the UAW was an organizer in this march, and the UAW paid for the sound system, where Martin Luther King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Walter Reuther also spoke at that same rally. And this is part of how we remember. I just want to kind of put a fine point on this, but the way that we remember, or the way that we tell the civil rights movement, is it was about Martin Luther King saying, equality, and, black people and white people should hug it out and everything's going to be great, while really downplaying the socialism of Dr. King, his anti-capitalism, pretty sharp, pretty pointed criticisms of capitalism, of the Vietnam War, and the involvement of labor in this effort is just kind of left out of the entire story. So I do want to touch on that. I want to point out that the civil rights movement was really a coalition of labor and civil rights leaders. In 1965, Randolph and Bayard Rustin began the A. Philip Randolph Institute under the aegis of the AFL-CIO. So in 1955, the AFL and the CIO merge. In 65, Randolph begins the A. Philip Randolph Institute. And the goal of this is to, promote civil rights advancement in the world of labor, and to use that power of that coalition between the civil rights leaders, the civil rights movement, and organized labor. Also in the 60s, so that's kind of what's happening in the South. That's kind of what's happening in Detroit and what is now the Rust Belt with auto manufacturers and steel and heavy industry and so on. In California in the 60s, there's something pretty exciting happening. So I've talked about Filipino farm workers. I've talked about these waves of Asian immigration in California and in the West. And I've talked about how the Wagner Act, so 1935's Wagner Act, leaves out agricultural workers. So you have a history of labor organizing through the from the early 20th century through the 30s, through the 40s, 50s. So in the 40s, in 1946, again, right after the World War II, the U.S. government and the Mexican government come up with a program called the Bracero Program. And Bracero means... Bracero is arm in Spanish, I think? Anyway, the Bracero Program was a guest worker program. And this is the kind of thing, and this is very similar to the way that we continue to talk about guest worker programs as this kind of humane way, like this liberal way to let's let people come here and work and earn some money. But really, what it is it's part of a scheme to, primarily, it's part of a scheme to keep labor, rootless. And to keep that kind of reserve army of the unemployed able to be pulled in. That's exactly what a guest worker is, and that's what the border kind of maintains. Which at force, at the point of a gun, that's what a border maintains: is that ability to dip into this reserve pool of labor, where the wages are much lower over the border, and so you can say, hey, come on over. You're going to make more here, but still less than union workers, on the U.S. side of the border. And that's all the guest worker program is. So the Bracero Program is just dipping into a reserve pool of labor whenever Mexican American workers are organizing, or Filipino farm workers are organizing. And so the Bracero Program is kind of interesting because a lot of Mexican Americans are resentful of these braceros, and it's, on the one hand, they're trying to make a living, but they're encountering discrimination and some resentfulness from white Americans as well as Mexican Americans, because they're coming over to and taking. I mean, the point of the Braceros is to take the jobs of Mexican American workers. Anyway, so there's organizing, and it is undercut by racism. These kind of institutional obstacles, such as the Wagner Act and Taft-Hartley, which do not cover agricultural workers, and then you got the Bracero Program. But by the 60s, by the mid-60s, you have the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, which is the Filipino farm worker union, led by Larry Itliong. And they began a grape boycott in 1965. And you have a Mexican American Workers Association led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, which more people are familiar with Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the what will become the United Farm Workers. But that begins as the National Farm Workers Association, and they become the United Farm Workers in 1966 when they join forces. It's a Filipino Farm Worker Union and a Mexican Farm Worker Union. Anyway, so what's interesting about this is it draws on. So this is not directly linked to the Black Civil Rights movement that's happening, but it draws on a similar idea, right? You get kind of inspired by the Civil Rights movement. You get the Chicano movement. You get the American Indian movement. The 60s. This is a time of identity politics. Coming into its own, feminism, etc. And the United Farm Workers really tap into this pride in their ethnicity, and this is something that is fairly powerful and is influential, and they do manage to make real inroads in an industry that has the entire deck stacked against them. So now at 1970. So here's a button I have, and okay, we're gonna try to get it in focus. It says Nixon eats lettuce, and it's got this is one of my prizes. I'm kind of a pen collector. I've got some pretty cool Labor pens and plenty of other pens, but this is like a prize. Hang on, I can't even. Let's see. I can't get in focus. It will not get in focus. Anyway, trust me, it says Nixon eats lettuce. And it's got the United Farm Workers logo down here at the bottom, which is a stylized eagle from the eagle on the Mexican flag. So what this means, so in 1970, so grapes and lettuce are kind of the main products that the UFW is organizing around. They're striking in lettuce fields, and they organize what is called a secondary boycott. So this is a bit of an obscure point, but just to illustrate, just kind of like the creativity and the scrappiness. So unions that are covered under the Wagner Act, and then later Taft-Hartley. So unions that are regulated by this labor legislation, they're not allowed to do what is called secondary boycotts. They can call for a boycott, which means, okay, if you've got a dispute with Home Depot, you're on strike at Home Depot, and you form a picket line outside the store, and you encourage everybody to boycott Home Depot, because then they lose business and it strengthens your position. What you're not allowed to do is you're allowed to do that under the Wagner Act. What you're not allowed to do is a secondary boycott. So Home Depot doesn't work for this example, but let's say you're harvesting lettuce. You're in a labor dispute with management. You can ask people to boycott that lettuce company, but you can't ask people to boycott the stores that sell that lettuce under the Wagner Act. UFW is not covered under the Wagner Act because of, again, going back to the racism of the 30s. So they're able to call for secondary boycotts, and they say, don't buy lettuce, don't go to these stores that sell this particular brand of lettuce. And part of the strategy and kind of like in demonizing this lettuce grower is saying Nixon eats lettuce. I'm assuming this is from the 1970 campaign. Nixon is a villain already, even before Watergate, and so it's like, don't be Richard Nixon. Don't eat lettuce. Don't buy lettuce. Anyway, so in the 60s and in the 70s, the UFW gets support from the CIO. Substantial support, right? So in the same vein as civil rights organizing, they say, hey, we're gonna ally with UFW. We support your cause. Cool. So something interesting happens in 73. There's a strike in grape fields in California, in and around Delano, California. UFW workers are on strike. What happens is the growers, the field owners, they go to the Teamsters, and the Teamsters agree to act as strike breakers. So this is one instance. There's a few kind of ugly periods of time where unions will act against other unions and undercut other unions and act as strike breakers. And this is one of them. And this is particularly ugly because it gets violent. There's a lot of big, burly white dudes who are Teamsters, and they come out to the picket lines, and fights break out, and it's violent, and people get hurt. This is notable because race plays a factor here. But the Teamsters, tend to be white. UFW is Mexican and Filipino. And they sign a deal with the grape growers, the Teamsters do, to become the workers' representation. And the UFW says that's a company union. You're acting as a company union, which is illegal. And they combat it, and it kind of goes on, and it continues like that for a few years until finally they reconcile and stand in solidarity with the UFW. But this is the kind of thing that happen. I mean, these are the conflicts that happen. If you've watched this series, you may have picked up on the notion that I'm trying to communicate that race is a very important part of labor history. It very much shapes not just prejudice, not just racist attitudes or anything, but it shapes who does what work. And when you've got these whole industries which are segregated for various reasons, a combination of reasons, then you get conflicts like this where one union, which is mostly white, will undercut a Mexican and Filipino union. And this is one way that capital divides workers. And in my opinion, the way to address this is head on. I don't think that, I disagree. If you haven't picked up on this by now, I disagree with this kind of class first, strategy of emphasizing class, because when it comes, if you aren't proactive about addressing, if you don't educate around anti-racism, when it comes down to it, a lot of white workers historically have sided with whiteness over class. And that's the fact of it. And you see it time and time again. And, you know, you can say, well, it's 2021 and white people didn't do that anymore, but they do. Sorry. Anyway, so that's about the end of this portion of this episode in labor history. And I will be back very soon to talk about deindustrialization. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye.